Hello. It is us. We're Wednesday.
It is us.
We're Debate Sensei. We're Wednesday.
Who am I?
I'm Wednesday. You're Debate Sensei, and he's going with you until
And Tuesday's gone.
We're talking about voter identification. I mean, one of the reasons being
boring.
Yeah. This is our third week. We talk about things that are like really in the news. And I think Texas just signed it into law, right? Where they had a voter ID sort of boost in their little legislature there.
In there.
Yeah.
That stands for in there with an I.
In there.
So, we're trying to track these debates because they find their ways into like rounds in competition and stuff like that. So knowing things that are going on in the world is an important part of being competitive, and so that's what we're going to do. We're going to do a sort of a dive into this here.
Should we formalize a resolution to talk about, or should we just
not
roll?
necessarily. I think that no matter what the resolution is, as long as it's about voter ID, like the first thing you got to worry about, like, and when you're talking about voter ID just conversationally with people,
right,
the first thing you got to like is attention to detail, because not all the laws are created the same.
Yeah, I want to just frame this really quick, very basically. The resolutions are going to sound something like voting ID. Voter ID laws are good.
I'm gonna have to disagree with you.
Voter ID laws are good, and the affirmative would promote them, or they are bad, and the affirmative would have to disprove their, the bad things.
Like more elections should require voter identification would be a resolution.
Right.
And so you got to be really careful about how the plan is defined, because there's there's a couple of dozen states that have voter ID laws, and they're not all the same.
Well, it wouldn't necessarily require a plan if it was voter ID is good or something like that.
That's true too. So,
right.
Yeah. As your little dabble of background, I believe it's 34 states have some form of voter ID requirement, and 8 of those have strict photo ID requirements.
Yeah. So it's those photo ID, like you don't have to go strict. Like if you find yourself on the side where you have to defend voter IDs, and you still have options on how to defend it. But if you're talking with somebody about voter identification laws too, like you want to you're like, so are you talking about strict voter ID, or are you talking more relaxed? Because I even heard there was a place.
What specific policy are you arguing is bad or good when they're talking about voter ID? Voter ID is just a broad stroke term, which could mean many, many things, right?
So I just have a question for you in your research, if you could find the answer to this. Every single election in which I've ever voted, which is all of them that I was able to vote in, I just handed in a pre-completed ballot into a polling station, or I mailed it in. I've never gone to the place and filled the thing out while everyone waited.
And I have never mailed a ballot in until coronavirus. I have always gone to the local, junior high, and there's a polling station. There's a bunch of older folks.
Yards of those. That's cool on election day. They just what? Matt's welcome. It's voting day. But so I have to sign the ballot, right? That's one requirement, and that signature is verified. Is that voter identification?
If I was on that list, I wouldn't be able to vote. You know what I mean?
So in general, no. That's another thing. It's like you could even, if you wanted to get even stricter than the strict voting laws, you could say, all right, we're abolishing mail-in ballot voting. You have to come in. That's extreme level stuff, right?
I was wondering. I mean, I don't want to deviate too hard, and please enlighten me if you know, and if you don't, we could just talk about something else. But how do you voter ID mail-in ballots? Riddle me that.
Right?
Yeah. They don't.
Right.
So all they're doing is verifying that it's coming from the right address, and official ballots are only sent to registered voters. So they're
hey, Nolan, thanks for the comment.
Yeah.
This past election, when I was looking into, so many. Good to see you, man. When I was looking into all of there was a ton of uproar this past year about the threat of voter fraud, right? of,
Right.
so many states were sending ballots to the wrong address, states, ballots being thrown away, postmaster generals being fired, like all kinds of craziness, right?
Right.
And in looking into that, they said that every ballot will have the signature on it verified.
Yeah.
And it was something like 9% or less were like flagged as like potentially problematic, and then like a very small fragment of that, like a small percentage of that group was actually sent back saying like, nope, these signatures don't match. That still seems like it's verifying some.
And I've heard stories where the 9%,
any old blank ballots that look like they were, photocopied off at a Xerox store and then mailed in jankily. Like, I don't think that that's necessarily the threat, right? It's like, I would assume that like the lowest bar of voter identification, if I were trying to run a squirrely plan, would be like requiring signature verification. Well, I guess that would be a plan because like
that's already a thing, isn't it? That's status quo, I think.
Yeah,
in
so
California.
the signature verification, like I think.
I guess that doesn't fall into the stricter definition of voter or like.
Yeah. So I think
it doesn't fall into ID.
Yeah, the most relaxed I've seen is like allowing for other than just photo identification, it would be like sort of a bill or a bank statement also is applicable in some of these areas. So when you said that there was 8 of them that have strict voter ID, those other ones probably have some sort of non-photo identification option that people can do.
Yeah.
And I mean, look, I think we're going to talk a lot about why they're bad, we should talk about that. But I want to say, there are some very basic arguments that you can say, and they're not, I mean, in my opinion, I should say this, saying that, voter identification requirements could potentially make it a safer election in a sense that you know who is going to vote. That premise isn't like insanely off-putting to me.
No.
The implications,
the
implications of who has IDs and stuff like that affect the point. But I just basically saying, don't be scared to state the obvious. It's like you have to ID at a bar. I mean, like, so it's kind of a. Why do you do that?
This is DebateSensei, right? Like we're evaluating all sides of the topic.
Right. Don't be scared to hit it straight on. Safer elections. That's not wrong. I mean, in my mind,
like the down the middle arguments, right?
Yeah, right. I think on the affirmative, I think the most strategic thing to go for is more of a public trust argument.
Right. Exactly. Like accountability or something.
I just think it's really strategic to go for that because you could find statistics that there's really low like public trust in elections, and this is
uniquely
one thing.
Right now as well, right?
Yeah, it could increase the public trust. I think the evidence that you could do is a little bit more solid. Right. If you're on the affirmative, I'd suggest avoiding the whole fraud argument altogether. Personally,
if you're on the affirmative of what resolution? Sorry.
Yeah, of like voter ID, I'd go hard for public trust, and because like eventually pro
voter ID.
Yeah. If you're doing it for voter ID, I think the most strategic argument to go for is, or at least a strategic argument to go for is more of a public trust.
It makes logical sense, and it's very low hanging fruit. And I mean, it's kind of what makes it so strong, and even in public opinion, I think, because of how common we have to present IDs for airports or wherever you go. I mean, so
what's your terminal impact on that, Jared? Is just like more voter turnout, like people believe in the process, therefore they turn out.
Yeah, I mean,
public trust.
Yeah,
that's the thing. Like, why is public trust good? Why do we care?
Right. That's one of. So you're touching upon the weakness a little bit, but yes, voter turnout I think would be something that you could statistically point out. I also think that we got a pretty good story that this public trust is resulting in some levels of violence, and just so. Like I think that would also be considered
the eroding of democratic norms.
Wouldn't you have to say, in your uniqueness, then, like, wouldn't you have to make the case that in the 2020 election there was not very much voter identification, and that's what led to this public mistrust and insurrection, if you want to go that far?
Yeah, you would have to say that, but
partially, to some degree, right?
But the thing is that public trust is a perception issue. All I really need to prove is that perception exists, and not that there's a good reason for it or that it was based on fact or anything like that. You know what I mean? It's like it could just be.
But like you gotta move the needle though, right? So like, assuming if we were to say right now that 0 states had any form of voter ID, and that like the flags that everyone on the steps the Capitol was waiving said like ID every voter, like say that was like the real sticking point of any kind of public mistrust. Not that that was like the unique problem, but assuming that's the case, you moving the needle would be like, all right, now we're going to require all states, or require a large portion of states. But in the 2020 election, 34 states did have voter ID
some form
requirement, right? Yeah. Which is not 50, right? So there's still like a decent number there that don't. Other 16 states like to be covered. That
nice math there,
Tim. Saying like that's where the plan would be. Like, hey, we're upping that number from 34 to 50, and that's going to make people trust it.
Yeah, I would actually downplay the actual impact to like voter turnout and everything like that. I just say, listen, this really isn't going to affect eligibility or the number of people voting or people who are ineligible to vote. Like that's really not.
That's where your attack will. You will be attacked there.
That it's going to do. The only advantage I'm going for is this perception advantage. Right. That would be public trust, and just like it'd be a little bit more peaceful if. So
or like even if.
Yeah,
if you ran your
reducing my burden that way, that's for sure. I'm not
going for it. If you ran your criteria as accountability, whoever makes the world more accountable is better. And then you're like, I'm not saying more voters is good. I'm not saying anything is good other than the accountability argument. And if I can win that, then I win. And if you can get them to stick with you, it's just kind of narrow, but
Well, that's I'm trying to boil down. Like that's what I was asking, like the terminal, like why is voter trust important? Like, why does it matter?
Well, because
saying, like, okay, protesting and even violence can come about when people don't trust the system. Okay,
so or non-participation, apathy.
Yeah. Would you say it again, Tim?
So I was just confirming, like, so the majority of your narrative is like because like protesting and rioting and violence can happen when people don't trust the system. Like that's the negative.
Yeah, listen, this is a really simple sort of olive branch that doesn't affect turnout or anything like that can like it's a symbol of like we are doing our due diligence to do all this sort of stuff, and it will help increase civil discourse and lower violence.
And on top of that, number 2 would be something along the lines of democratic participation, right? If on both sides of the aisle, at least on Main Street, in my opinion, there are cynical people who truly believe that nothing means nothing anymore, and your vote doesn't really matter. Tim, you've had many discussions on this podcast about how like even local elections, if your mistrust of a federal election trickles into your mistrust of all elections, and now all of a sudden you just have people who aren't participating, and that's kind of what's going on right now. Like you know better than all of us, right?
Yeah.
So it's still telling the story. Okay, I buy that.
Yeah, it's
it's so easy especially in like federal is such a circus, right? Or like any really large scale.
So big, yeah.
Is so like there's so many holes, like very legitimate holes that can be poked in it, and like so many good ways to attack. Like this system is broken. We're not going to make it better by
democracy
feeling more snugly about it, right? But if you're getting beyond the like headline version of elections and down to the like what this actually does in your community,
right?
If we get more people to care about the process, you'll have more people run for like their local district comptroller's office, right? Or like you will have more qualified people sitting on like your local city council, or like whatever the small thing that is a great representation of democratic participation.
Okay, I like that. That's a way better sell than my initial one. I was really downplaying a lot of stuff and going for the minimal, like just clearing the bar type of approach. But yeah, that's a little bit more lofty. I like the way it sounds. It could be like an additional advantage. Yeah.
You just used the word qualified, Tim. Like the person most qualified will get it.
Yeah.
Whether that's my word, I would probably choose is more. You could. In local elections, Tim has argued, many times here that you have a lot more power per square inch with the local election because your vote counts so much more, right?
Yeah.
So qualified is a good answer, but I would also say like the person who aligns with what you want, which I guess is qualified, but it's also kind of more of an opinion.
Well, I wasn't even getting like we will elect better officials. Well, yes, we'll elect better officials, but like not even so much democratic participation insofar as voting. But democratic participation insofar as running, like people that trust the system are more willing to run.
So this is two separate things,
That's where I would get with it, because like if you have the blanket statement of like this means people trust the system. I saw that a lot in like when coaching novices, it would be like people respect the law, or like people are willing, like people are this would increase trust in the government. Like, And then one team comes in and they're like, why should we trust the government?
Yeah.
And you're like, well, okay, good point. Like, that's a good question to ask. Why should we trust the government? Like, why should laws be followed? Like, there are good reasons, there are good answers to them, but there are also really bad answers to them. Like, we have really corrupt laws. Why should we be following those? Well, because if people didn't follow, like, decided they just didn't want to follow any laws, right? So it can be broken down. But
It's
I like
existential,
the
man.
democratic argument. If it's like, why should we participate in democracy? Because if people don't participate, then the same people that are already in power are more likely to stay in power, and more likely to be like,
because someone is participating.
From the needs of the people.
Yeah, if I was faced against that argument, though, I'd make sure that we were keeping it local to elections, right? It's not just like, just because you believe in like the person who was elected is actually in office. That's one level of public trust that should be the lowest bar for us to clear, right? We don't necessarily need to believe that they're always going to make the right decision, just that they were fairly elected. And so that was all I was going for. I'm not saying it's like, okay, now we have to just like blindly follow anything that they say as well.
And getting a larger cross section of voters is good. I mean, I'll argue that right here. Like, so if we can increase participation,
too, right? Like, the greater, you know, the broader the selectorate, the better the policy or better the candidate, probably.
The better reflection of what the people in mass want, right?
Sure.
Right. So let's go neg.
Yeah.
Thank goodness.
Perfect. Like judo use of force to now turn into like, and now about that.
How could voter ID laws be bad?
Percentage and representative population. Yeah. So
first thing, like, do criterion work, right? It's like, I think, but if they're going for this generic, it's like, oh, we're just doing net benefits. You're like, no. My favorite criteria on this specific case would be like, whoever has the highest number out of the number of people who are disenfranchised versus the amount of voter fraud that we catch. If there are more people that are disenfranchised than the voter fraud, neg wins. Neg wins. You know what I mean? It's like, I think, and so now it's one of my favorite impact analysis cases. It's one of my favorite ones because it's so like,
you can actually line things up and weigh them.
Yeah.
Okay, so now, granted, your neg strategy right here, though, is shooting at the target of the affirmative is all about catching voter fraud. Your own affirmative is not about catching voter fraud.
Well, hold on. On the neg, you're going to need to get evidence.
More about getting people to participate.
Yeah, so, that's a really good point.
Talk about the general argument, because like we can assume most down the middle affirmatives, like Matt was saying before, like we shouldn't have voter fraud. We can all agree on that. And that's most people's down the middle argument, like voter ID helps prevent voter fraud, right?
Right.
So if that's the common softball affirmative, then the softball neg totally makes sense. Yeah, criterion work, go for voter fraud versus disenfranchisement, right? I really like that. I think you can go even deeper and being like, challenge the premise. Does voter ID cause, like, does it actually catch any fraud?
And if I may, I'm sorry, Jared. I know you're chomping at the bit. One thing you're going to need to do on the neg is use evidence showing that the voter fraud problem, I don't know where you're from, I don't know what you believe, I'm going to say some things on this internet that you may not agree with, but according to the news and people who report studies, voter fraud is not a very big problem, right? So this concept that you need a safer election, as if it is so unsafe that we need to do something now, is arguable. It's not if it's not a problem.
What Tim was talking about is really good because like the criterion that I proposed, you have to explain how that criterion necessarily outweighs the public trust argument. Right.
So and so
that happens at the same time. You're kind of saying, so what is the implication of this criteria? This criteria doesn't include a public trust weighing mechanism at all because it's not enough. It doesn't outweigh this thing. If I win on this, it doesn't matter how much public trust you increase because that is not as important as this. You see what I'm saying? Like, so that's part of that's part of it. And so, and it's also the reason why I advise people don't go for the fraud argument in the affirmative because they're just do this shit to you anyway.
And I also want to just, while you're talking about public trust, like kind of very precisely talk about how increasing public trust is not the same argument as saying the election is more secure.
Yeah.
Right? Those are not the same thing. So just understand when Jared and we are talking about, secure elections, that's one thing. Public trust is a completely different thing. So, who cares about public trust if more people are voting? I think that's kind of what Jared's saying, yeah?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So so it starts becoming one of the like I said, one of my favorite ways that I've ever sort of done impact analysis. So
Yeah.
I made some banners here. Take a look at this. So
Show me them banners.
Yeah, we're gonna do disenfranchised voters versus fraud, right?
I don't see anything.
All right. So first,
There we
take
go.
a look. So basically, you can calculate disenfranchised voters. Is you take the number of people that don't have an identification, and you take the percentage of them that will vote or are registered to vote, and the percentage of that who can't get an ID because of cost or administrative error. Let me explain that one. So for cost, unless you subsidize identification for everybody, you're at risk of having things getting thrown out.
Nolan, I'm going to get to that, Nolan. Go ahead.
Yeah. All right.
Like a ballot,
you're at risk. For like
tax,
it's poll,
right?
yeah, it's like it's like a poll tax. So you might have some sort of subsidy in there. It's like if you can't afford ID, the state will pay for it, type of thing, right? But that means you have to like pay for people's gas if they're in rural areas, whatever. But the administrative error one was one of the things that fascinated me most. There are a lot of people who were born with incorrect birth certificates and they cannot get identification. Now, these people tended to be the ones who could not afford to be born in a hospital. So you're talking about people of color and poor people.
Well, yeah, and just really quick, Jared, I don't want to I want you to keep going, but a homeless person, for instance, let's say you've been homeless for, say, 10 years or so, you don't have an address. You can't get an ID without an address. So there are barriers, economic barriers. There are, there are many barriers, but my point is just the poor. Jared mentioned the poor just now. And if you're talking about the homeless, the only way to exercise power in this world is to vote. And so if you can't vote, if an entire population of homeless people can't vote because they don't have valid IDs, well, they're going to be disenfranchised per se. So
yeah, but my point is that you could actually calculate what you could make a conservative estimate, right? So take a look. We know how many people don't have identification. It's 21 million. They've done that.
420.
All right. And so let's say that out of that 21 million, only 20%. That's incredibly low voter turnout number right there. Like on average, the rest of the population.
Is this federal?
58. Yeah, just across the nation.
There's 330 million people. So if 21 million vote, that's like less than 1%.
Yeah, don't have. It's 11%.
11%.
Don't have ID. And let's say that 0.01% of them just can't get the ID. They can't afford it.
Which is crazy conservative to assume, right? Because like of those folks that don't have ID, probably a pretty significant percentage of them don't have it because they can't get it. There's some people like walking around that are just like never needed it, never will. It's like, well, there are some obstacles that are in the way. Otherwise, you already would have it. Like life is certainly harder without ID than it is with ID.
Yeah.
That's
that number right there. See,
right?
Like 420 out of that's the 158 million. That's how many people voted. That's like in 2016. So that was my latest. See, like you can actually calculate this. All right.
Sure.
And now you could calculate voter fraud, and voter fraud would be the number of reported cases, and then you have to do like how many of those are how underreported is that? If these are just the ones that we caught, how many did we not?
By the way, the underreported statistic is one of my favorite statistics. It's like, how do you know what isn't reported, right? So always be skeptical.
So that's another crazy thing is like they've caught in-person voter fraud, and the number is 214 cases out of 1 billion votes.
Out of 1 billion?
Out of 1 billion votes.
I got a source from Washington Post. There was a professor of law at Loyola Law School that said that number is 31, not 214. But I'd be interested to compare sources.
I think that's.
I don't believe either of those numbers.
No, I think it's 214 out of the last 20 years, and so that's a billion votes. All right, and so remember, this is just in-person voting.
Well, hold on. Let me argue with you. You just said there was 21 million voters. 21 million times 20 years.
21 million folks without ID.
Good job, Tim.
Of the 21 million folks that would qualify to vote, but that do not have ID. That's what that number is.
So when you do all that math, if you say that like 1,000, that's only like out of the 214, that it's actually 214,000 fraud votes. Like you only catch 1 out of 1,000. That's still that number right there.
These statistics are very, very interesting. I wanted to mention something really quick.
Let me simplify it.
Oh, there you go. That was way more exciting that way. You see that, everybody on the internet? 266 is greater than 22.
Because the alligator eats the one that's bigger.
Nolan earlier brought up a very good word. He used the word mask. I love the masking argument. Okay, any voter ID plan or any sort of strict plan that requires only people at the polls to bring valid ID, picture ID, whatever you want to call it, but still allows mail-in voting, which, by the way, mail-in voting, the pro is a lot of people vote. People who can't get to the polls, people who have no access to anything, they can vote. But if you want to really implement public trust using the voter ID model, stick the app to it, and say, are you eliminating mail-in ballots? Because if you're not, Jared already mentioned, you're not going to be able to voter ID the mail-in ballots. So what does this have to do with Nolan's comment? Nolan said masking problems. If you are trying to prove that you're going to increase public trust by making the people who go to the polls present a valid ID, a photo ID, whatever you want to call it, but you don't make the people who mail them in that maybe even more, you could argue that it seems like we're trying to create the perception that we're fixing something while systemic problems continue to happen. Now, this is also a very slippery slope. So just understand that the premise of this argument, the masking argument, is just focused on how, unless they're going to really go for the gold on the app and be like, you have to present an ID or something like that, and that will secure the election. Otherwise, you fall victim to, the issues. Although watch out, because the app is going to start using your own evidence saying there's not a lot of voter fraud.
So is the neg? I mean, would you then, Matt, recommend on the neg to be like, hey, affirmative team, you need, if you're actually in support of voter ID, you need to voter ID mail-in ballots. Otherwise, you aren't solving diddle and topicality. Your case,
as far as the public trust,
press, like your case only applies to in-person ballots.
Well, it does. I should be careful. Maybe there's some states that require a scanned copy of your ID or something like that. But
I've never seen that.
I haven't seen that either. So I just mean to say that if someone's going to get up there and say on the app, which sounds very good, very logical, very simple, you require IDs, you're kind of more sure of who's in there. That's so simple. You know what I mean? But then you go, but like 2/3 of the people are voting by mail who aren't even there. So why? You're just creating the perception that you're fixing it. Well, if you really believe it's that messed up, it's going to continue to keep going that way, or perpetually get worse. That's the real masking argument, I think. Right? Thanks, Nolan.
Right? Yeah. Like it's the amount of time and money and energy and effort spent on this ID thing, right? So
and
it was like Arkansas spent something like $10 million on like a public ID program, like trying to literally creating IDs for people that didn't have IDs, like state IDs.
Right.
They spent like $10 million. Like those things,
which is not a lot of money, by the way. $10 million.
That need people and need plastic and need mailing and all kinds of stuff. So
you have to buy some of the solvency with a plan text a little bit on this. You know what I mean? It's like
if you're in a policy round,
if you're on the affirmative, you're like, okay, we got to devote some money, we got to subsidize this, otherwise we're walking headlong into a bunch of people who who can't afford to get it, and now like you're risking a constitutional challenge on that one,
right? And we'd be shameful people not to mention this before we get off this podcast in the last minute here, but and I realize we're three white men up here talking to you, but there's a whole slew of articles, studies, and evidence that show there's disproportionate effects on minorities and things of that, and those communities that voter ID laws affect disproportionately, which means in a bad way. And that is being used, or there are people who believe that is being used as a weapon to target those communities to prevent people from voting, in say Georgia or something like that, where you can go look it up on the internet and find tons of evidence as to how that is actually, the mechanisms are affecting different groups of people differently.
But you don't. You could just go 2 days ago, North Carolina, or 5 days ago, struck down their voter ID law.
Right.
specifically because of this, because of discriminatory reasons. You know what I mean? And so like this is really contemporary stuff.
Let me tell you, just because I want to go over time, and I love going over time. And I took a class a long time ago called Constitutional Law. And here's something frightening I'm going to tell all of you in the world. It turns out you could write a law that has no on its face prima facie discrimination towards a certain race or gender or something like that, with the intent to do that. But as long as it appears to be about something else, that's allowed. That's allowed. It's frightening. Your own rules around you can be dictated by people who want to implement negative things towards specific groups or whatever it may be. And as long as it appears to be for some other purpose, it's all good. And this is kind of one of those things where, you know, the big, meaty, juicy argument on the neg is basically this is a weapon to prevent people from voting, to maintain control by a certain group of people. And that's definitely something that is we haven't mentioned yet, but it's a very important part.
Well, I mean, that's my whole disenfranchisement argument is that like the. Like
well, you didn't say it like I said it, dog.
Yeah, I know. I gave
8% of white voters don't have ID, and 25% of African American voters do not have ID or qualified voters. Like that's so. There's just some straight like if it impacts or a voter ID policy would impact different ethnic groups differently, right? Or like in Alabama where there's 71%. So the state did not allow resident IDs, right? So state funded housing IDs, they required DMV driver's licenses or like government issued IDs. And 71% of the folks that lived in public housing were African American. And then they shut down the DMVs in those counties. So like how explicit and straightforward does it need to be that it's like a targeted policy in some really rough areas? Like there are real problems to it. So I think like North Carolina,
there's some alternative purpose beyond election security.
Check out the North Carolina decision. I think that's really, really applicable right now. All right, everyone.
I had fun.
Yeah, not bad at all.
Covered some good stuff.
All right. If you got anything else you want us to address, man, put it in some comments, okay? We'll get to it at any time. All right.
Hey, thanks, Nolan. It was great hanging out with you, buddy.
It's Tim, Matt, and Jared. I'll see you later. Bye.